where he's providing wonderful leadership, quite frankly, to faculty, staff, students, communities in developing and implementing all sorts of strategic initiatives that promote our mission for commitments to diversity, inclusion, and equity. He is an alumnus of the School of Education. He got his MS degree, master's degree, and his PhD from the Department of Ed Leadership and Policy Analysis. I'm going to take the liberty of mentioning a few things with LaVar's permission about his background, give you a little sense for those of you who aren't familiar with it. LaVar, Dr. Charleston, grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and he didn't play football until he was in 10th grade, but he got a scholarship to play football at Ball State, and he took it. He's always, what many people don't know is he's invested very, very deeply in music. That would be an understatement, including in singing groups and bands since he was a young boy. He's done everything from opening up R&B groups like Drew Hill and Genuine, Case, Vivian Green, to singing backup for Lyle Lovett, and even for gospel artists like Marette Brown Clark. He also, on a very personal level, is an avid motorcyclist, many of you know, and he belongs to the Mad City Street Soldiers, where he is currently the Sergeant at Arms. I could go on, but I also want to briefly mention that LaVar is a closet thespian. Has been many, several independent films and plays, including a production of August Wilson, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, and the opera, as well as Charlie Parker's Yardbird. He currently sings with Madison Day Soul, Neil Soul, and if those of you know the R&B group Kinfolk. We are very, very pleased that LaVar is joining us during this challenging time. We'll start discussion with some prepared questions that we've talked about, and then we'll take questions from the audience. You can, throughout our event, use the Q&A tool, as Carrie indicated, on the lower right hand of your screen, and so on, to submit a question at any time. But we will certainly keep it wide open at the end of our conversation. And if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Carrie Dickinson. So with that, once again, we're very, very pleased to have all of you with us to come together during this very, very challenging and critically important time for our university, our state, our nation, and this world. So let me begin with kind of a first question as an opener by asking Dr. Charleston, could you tell us a little bit, LaVar, about your role in the School of Ed and what your office is doing?
Well, thank you, Cliff, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I am pleasantly surprised to see how many folks are on this call. And I appreciate your time. This is a very important topic that we're all dealing with during this time. So I'd first like to thank WISCAPE for the opportunity to have this conversation today, and especially today during a time where our country and our communities have been reeling, really reeling due to, I'd say, two pandemics at the same time. That is COVID-19, that has really had a disproportionate impact on communities of color, and also the impact of systemic racism that has permeated throughout our country for literally over 400 years, that has again come to a boiling point and to a head. In that same vein, I'd like to start out by this conversation by saying that the University of Wisconsin occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land and a place their nation has called Day-Job since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory, and decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. The history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. And so today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. I personally have a lot of pride in and for the School of Education here at Wisconsin, being a two-time alum, having even been shaped by some of the deep critical thinking we had to do in your classes, Cliff, some 15 or so years ago, as I matriculated through the Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis Department. So when the School of Education decided to really invest in equity, diversity, and inclusion by not only creating a senior level position that would help to guide this work in the school, but also in an office that it ultimately helps the school, aim to be the first choice for current and future scholars, for leaders, for educators who desire to embody organizational and educational and inclusive excellence in the arts, in the health and education fields. I was unsurprisingly attracted to the position. So myself and the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, which we call OEDI, which is new, really provide and promotes initiatives that establishes and supports a culture of academic and inclusive excellence in the School of Education. We think about and really try to promote initiatives that recruit, retain, and support the success of historically marginalized students, faculty, and staff. And we do that by utilizing every person's individual and cultural assets as a competitive advantage to leadership, again, in the arts, in the health and education field. So we really, we really strive to support and promote a community of scholars, of practitioners, of collaborators within the school that effectively and efficiently enrich the quality of life for all of our faculty, staff, and students, as well as local communities and communities abroad. So I've spent the better of the last year building on at least 5 years of progressive, sustained action toward equity, diversity, and inclusion in the school. For example, in 2016, some of you may remember, the school presented the Moving Forward Together School of Education Stand and Plan Against Hate and Bias. In 2017, we conducted a School of Education Climate Survey. In 2018, the school produced a strategic plan for inclusive excellence. And then when I got here in 2019, I conducted an asset inventory, really thinking about and having spoken to over 100 school and community constituents in an effort to sort of unearth the school's pockets of excellence and areas of opportunity, which led to the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, or OEDI. I'll say ODI moving forward so you all know what I'm talking about. The implementation plan for that office that was recently presented to multiple School of Education groups this past semester to sort of gain feedback on that. So during this time, the office, we have reinvigorated the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee in the school that's comprised of students, staff, and faculty. We've reestablished the charge of the committee to promote the goals of equity, diversity, and inclusion by considering and making recommendations that really promote equitable and inclusive culture within the school, and importantly, crafting the first school-wide diversity statement, which can be viewed on our OEDI website. You can get to that by just going to the School of Education website. Right on that front page you see, you'll say diversity and inclusion or something. You click that button. So this statement, I believe, really responds to one of the challenges that we've had in the school. This is all LaVar's opinion, right? Having been here for graduate school, having worked in the school for quite a time before leaving, and then having come back. And that is, I believe that we have historically leaned heavily on the great equity work that the faculty, staff, and students have been doing in the school, right? Without necessarily a clear understanding, a vivid guidepost, a shared understanding, a shared standard for who we are as it relates to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that we could point to determine whether or not individuals or our policies or our practices or our curriculum in the school are or aren't upholding these values, right? So it is heretofore, to me, been assumed due to the social justice mission of our school, but not as clearly stated, that these things are sort of innate. This is who we are, right? Without that having that clear statement. So now, as foundational, we have a statement. And so I look at it like this, like building a business, right? Like you can't really build a business without having an effective business plan. And so as we think about the work of the school, particularly around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and increasingly, anti-racism, we have to have a foundation, a framework for how we look at this work. So, and that's simply to seek to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion by reducing barriers to access, by increasing the demographic diversity of our faculty, staff, and students, by encouraging scholarship, teaching, and service that really embraces and engages the full measure of diversity in our society. So we recognize as a school that our desire to be an anti-racist, unbiased, and inclusive academic community is ongoing, right? And it involves shared commitment, shared responsibility, shared action, shared accountability. So we believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion, and inclusive excellence, right, all are our approach to generating this sort of positive and lasting change that builds on our scholarship and our school's reputation as the #1 public school in the country, right, and as a leading educational institution. So a more clear depiction for those who want to read that of our statement is on our website as well, along with 4 diversity value propositions and commitments that really support the school efforts that can too be found on our website. So ultimately, the framework and guiding principles that shapes both myself and the office is around 4 things, right? I mean, inclusive excellence, which really is around cultivating a culture of action that fosters enhanced diversity, equity, inclusion, and accountability, importantly. So sometimes the term inclusive excellence, and for those who've heard my talks, I talk about this a lot, it sort of gets thrown around as sort of a catch-all buzzword, right? We started talking about that like maybe 12, 13 years ago. But to be sure, you can't have inclusive excellence without, I call them the 2 A's, without action and accountability. So if we're talking about inclusive excellence and we don't see action and we don't see accountability, then it's not real inclusive excellence, right? Asset-based approaches, right? It's necessary to both inventory and capitalize on our existing strengths. We have to really think about how we support programs, policies, and practices that successfully highlight both individual and collective strengths that we have here in the school. Community engagement, it's important. We're a school of education. How do we do our work without identifying areas of overlap between public problems and school strengths, right? We have to move beyond sort of these traditional partnerships to establish new long-term collaborations that impacts the community, right? Really embodying the Wisconsin idea and the like. And last but not least, research-informed practices, right? We must simply, employ empirical-based strategies for recruitment, retention, and multiculturalism within higher education, and we have to establish protocols to measure and assess and evaluate the attainment of diversity-related goals in the school, and we must disseminate this data on best practices for both community edification and to create a constant cycle of both engagement and improvement. And so these are what my office is about, sort of the founding principles and sort of what we've been up to in the last semester.
Could you, thank you very much, Mark. Could you tell us a little bit about what drove you to do this work? What inspired you?
This
is the trigger. Yeah.
So this is a really interesting question because I can guarantee you that as a kid, or even as an undergraduate, or even as a graduate student, I did not plan on doing quote unquote diversity work. Right. I did not want to be labeled as someone who did diversity work. I thought it might have been taboo or limiting as it relates to my professional or academic career, or a bunch of things that kids who don't know any better think about, right? Like which I was at the time. I went to Ball State University and on a football scholarship, like you talked about. But I went there originally to study architecture. For anyone who knows anything about architecture and Division I football, you know that it's virtually impossible to do both simultaneously due to the demands of both, right? And so I ended up changing my major. And some other things around that, but that'll take us down a rabbit hole. But I ended up changing my major to industrial technology, to manufacturing engineer technology, and but like again, the demands of those fields did not line up with the expectations that my coaches had for me for football, right? And so, like many other STEM fields, many others in STEM fields, I did not persist in that, and that was largely due to the oftentimes antagonistic nature of academic identity development versus athletic development in big-time sports, right? But again, that's a whole nother conversation. But I ended up with a degree in public relations and marketing and went into business industry at first as a product line manager for a company called Borg Warner Torque Transfer Systems, and I was working on my MBA at the time. And I was in this role for a couple of years, and I have to tell you, the only thing I enjoyed about this role was the paycheck. The only thing I enjoyed. And so the things that I enjoyed in life, like creating music, and I was doing some Little League coaching at the time, I was no longer able to do due to the demands of the job. And for a person in their 20s, all work, no play, no fulfillment, it was horrible for me. So as fate would have it, I got a call from my alma mater, which is Ball State, to apply for assistant director position in the school of, in admissions, assistant director of admissions position. So why did they call me out the blue? Well, I had done an internship several years prior that was in what was then the Office of Admissions and Early Outreach Programs. And during my time in that internship, I worked with pre-college programs, several pre-college programs providing marginalized students exposure to college and really in an effort to enhance their likelihood of attending college, as well as doing a lot of editing, admissions presentations, and meeting with diverse schools and families to recruit primarily students of color. So while I had to pray diligently about the decision to move from my position at Borg Warner to academia because, if I recall correctly, it probably was like a $40,000 pay cut. But I was a kid. My car was paid for. My rent was like $400. Y'all remember those days? I mean, a long time ago, right? My rent was like $400, and I didn't have anything to lose at that time. I had some money saved up, so I was like, let me take the jump, right? And so I ultimately made the decision to take the job, assistant director of admissions. And so I was sent out to recruit in poor, rural, and urban areas. I was one of the only black folks who were doing that work, or the only black person who was doing that work. So naturally, they sent me to a lot of the urban areas, which included Detroit, where I'm from. And so as I would go into the schools, my teachers who were teachers when I was a student were now principals, right? And they were always requesting more from me than just basic admissions presentation. Go talk to these kids about grit, about the importance of college, about perseverance, about all these things. And so as I moved from school district to school district and school to school, I started seeing the holes in the system, right? Holes in the educational system. And I really wanted to affect policy and change at a larger level. The nerdiest date that I ever went on before was my girlfriend, who's now my wife. We went to a lecture at the University of Michigan as a date. Yeah, who does that? I don't know. I do. But the thing that I remember most about that lecture, which was Michael Eric Dyson, for those of you who know his work, it was a Michael Eric Dyson lecture. I don't remember anything about that lecture. What I do remember is the person that introduced him had a background that was like mine, Dr. Larry Rowley. And he was from Detroit. He was in business industry first, and then he switched to academia, and he was this PhD. And I'm like, wait, what is that? How do you do that? What is that? And so I reached out to him, cold call, email. After a couple of emails, he responded into what I know now, didn't know at the time, was basically a list of higher education scholars throughout the country. Long story short, one person on that list was Jelando Jackson. I reached out to him. We had something in common in being in the same fraternity, so I put something at the bottom of that cold call email that let him know that I was from the same organization, and I just did that by looking him up. We didn't have pictures on the internet back then, so I didn't know what he looked like. In fact, when I talked to him, for those of you who know Jelando, sounds like I thought he was an old, like 65-year-old dude from down south. Like the dude sounds super old. Long story short, enrolled in UW-Madison, enrolled in ELPA, where my failures and successes had come full circle, right? So the non-persistence, the antagonistic relationship between athletic and academic identity development, and I, through some fellowships and such, I've worked in the Dean of Students Office, the People Program, Wisconsin Center for Education Research as a research assistant and then research associate, and then, where my research areas was graduate school preparation and success, interventions that brought in participation in STEM, my own, story, academic identity development, student athletes. And then I really was on the ground floor helping out with the founding of the WE Lab, for those of you know, Wisconsin Equitable Inclusion Laboratory. Eventually become an assistant director, senior research associate, and coordinator of our research and evaluation division. And then, we developed some courses for ELPA, taught for about 7 years, did some work, some grants, NSF, Lumina, some other things. And then took another inaugural role at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater as inaugural assistant vice chancellor for student diversity, engagement, and success, where I reorganized what we call our high impact practices under one unit to help really increase the likelihood of participation, particularly among historically marginalized students. So I oversaw everything from the honors program to undergraduate research to study abroad and travel study programs, community-based learning, as well as our identity-based scholarship programs like McNair. And so I did that for a couple of years and then was drawn back to Madison for this important role. So I think that's enough of a rundown. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you very much. That's quite a narrative. What we'd like to ask you next is if you could, the School of Education is taking a good number of strategic initiatives to advance diversity, inclusivity, and you also mentioned, by the way, social justice a few minutes ago. If you were to identify 2 or 3 strategic initiatives that you think are really contributing to equity or inclusivity, diversity, and so on, and justice, what 2 or 3 might you highlight?
So that is a really difficult question. Let me preface it by saying this first. The great thing about our School of Education is its diversity across the arts, health, and education sectors, right? It's also one of the challenges, right? Because we are, 10 departments, multiple units, tons of research projects, and literally across 17 buildings on UW's campus. So it's challenging to capture all that's going on in the school, but that's also a call for us to increase sort of and enhance our communication strategies about what's going on and how we can collaborate with others, and we must do this in order to tell the true story of climate and culture around equity, diversity, and inclusion in our school. Bringing this down to 2 or 3, it's very, very, very difficult. Let me see how best to answer this, because we have things that are going on in health, in arts, and in communication, right? So let me do 2 or 3 areas and try to get through this pretty quickly about some of the things that we're doing, right? So if you think about the arts, right, I think about places like professional learning and community engagement, for example. They're doing the drum power, which uses arts through drum and dance to provide experiences for young people where they can develop new skills and explore, African cultural traditions, where they focus on social emotional learning, including discipline, community, and leadership. And so that's like one of the, that's something that we're doing in the school, but into the community for our young people, right? And then as I think about those areas for young people, we have the college access program, pre-college program, team program. So I'll use that area for young people, right? So team, and I'll talk about team, which is tomorrow's educators for equity in Madison, or the Team Scholars program, which is designed to prepare students for college careers in education, right? It recruits a diverse pool of MMSD students each year who have an interest in improving the educational opportunities for all students in the district, right? So the goal is to expose these students to diverse backgrounds, to all facets of teaching careers in MMSD, and prepare students for college and grow the teaching ranks at MMSD to reflect our student population, right? So let me use that as the pre-college sector, so right? And then as we think about, undergraduate, it makes me think about my office in our CERT program, Summer Education Research Program, and I think if the data serves me correctly, it's something like 87% of students who've come through our CERT program have been enrolled into our graduate programs, right? And so CERP is, it's a summer education research program. We pair students with faculty and give them research experiences in the summer, and we're actually running that now, even though we had to cancel some of our programs due to COVID-19. We moved that program virtually, and importantly, so that's just an example of sort of the undergrad piece. And there's just so many more as we think about that. But then moving to graduate studies, right? I think of EGGERS. EGGERS is one of the first things that come to mind. Education Graduate Research Scholars Program, which is a community of graduate students that receive a fellowship, and a stipend, and it offers, a support network of peers and assist students in becoming members of a supportive community. I can't really talk about EGGERS without talking about WCR Fellows Program, which really, provides a holistic research-based graduate socialization experience for historically marginalized students by really cultivating, social and professional support through peer and faculty mentoring, boot camps, academic planning, and seminar series, et cetera. And then it just takes me to the research piece, and I think of WeLab, where I used to work. So we got undergrad, graduate. So that's probably more than 2 or 3. But let me just say this too. So thinking about the research lab, the research areas, right? WCER, Wisconsin's Equity and Inclusion Laboratory, that designs, conducts, and disseminates research that informs policymakers, practitioners, concerned citizens on how to best promote equitable and inclusive work and learning environment. We got the Trans Research Lab. They're doing ongoing social justice-driven research and work that affirms, the experience of trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming and gender diverse folks, so TNG folks, right? And their work, is to transform and advance the position of TNG and gender diverse folks within the field of psychology. And speaking of TRL, though, how about that Supreme Court ruling this week, everyone? You don't have to say anything. I'm excited, right? We must continue the progress, and so happy Pride Month. And then also counseling training clinic, right? Thinking about preparing our students for engagement and diversity and focus initiatives, including the Diversity and Social Justice Committee and diversity dialogues, and so we can go on and on. That we have programs research, we have, K-12, we have undergraduate, we have graduate preparatory programs, and I'm telling you, I have a long list. I think of MSAN and all these targeted opportunity programs. So moving to faculty, right? And so I know I was hard-headed, Cliff, and I did not name two or three, but it's difficult to do that. And for a person who's pushing diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's difficult for me to put all those things in one bag. But I will say that through the campus targeted opportunity program that the School of Education has taken great advantage of, to the point where I think they're turning us away. We've been able to it has helped us to raise our faculty of color to, I think it's about 36% now, which I think the standard for higher education is like 30, or the benchmark is like 30%. So we're above that, and to be sure, we still have much work to do, and we'll be diligently working to create a more equity-minded School of Education. But that's just a couple of things we have. Sorry, I mean, I've left a bunch of stuff out, but that's a couple of things we have.
That's wonderful. Excuse me for interrupting, LaVar. That's a wonderful portrait of what we're doing. So I think that's going to be very helpful for me. A lot of things I didn't know about. Here's a question with respect to COVID-19. COVID-19 has triggered many challenges, including for traditionally underrepresented populations, with respect to online learning. And we wanted to ask you the question we talked about is challenges from technology and so on. What are you beginning to think about? What initiatives can we do in this COVID-19 period, which may go on for quite a while, and transforming our teaching from in person to much of it online? You got any ideas for strategies for overcoming these challenges with respect to traditionally underrepresented students?
So, there are a lot of equity concerns that arose, during this sort of campus transition, and as we move to remote learning. And I will start by saying that I'm pleased with the actions, that the university and the School of Education took in uncovering the equity needs, right? So it's, oftentimes we're like, we sort of spend a lot of time wondering what our needs are as it relates to equity and what our concerns are, and we kind of know on the surface, but we guess. I don't like guessing when we can find the answers out to questions, right? So I was really happy with our collaboration, our Maine School of Education's collaboration with DDEEA, the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Educational Achievement, as they did some needs assessment as early as spring break when the things first happened, right? And then the School of Education has done some subsequent assessments, particularly around the wellness checks that the School of Education has. We end up recruiting 190 faculty, faculty and staff to contact undergraduate and graduate students from their departments over a 3-week period during April. And so we didn't have to guess or assume what the concerns were. We were able to find those out, and so as we think about what we do and what we did about that, we did the wellness checks. I think was a key part of that, because we want to do 4 things, right? We want to provide human connection and emotional support to students during a very difficult and alienating time. We wanted to be able to provide students with information about resources. So we knew that financial aid was giving out grants. We knew that they were providing resources as it relates to technology and all those, and library resources and mental health resources. People were going through some challenges, right? Library resources and those sorts of things. So we wanted to be able to provide that. And then we wanted to be able to identify students who were experiencing significant need in the areas of thinking about connectivity, emotional well-being, academic concerns, financial hardship, and then really offer them a chance to connect to what we had and standing by was student help teams, right? So we were able to usher folks to talk to these other folks so that we can really, which is the sort of the 4th thing we wanted to do, which really document the challenges faced by students so that the School of Education could develop policies and garner resources to help the students' needs. And so, what we discovered, unsurprisingly, is that emergencies weighed more heavily on students that were made vulnerable by socioeconomic status and or racial inequalities, right? Students were really reporting concerns about immediate needs like financial, their funding, their TA, their peership funding, housing, childcare, course-related needs, and academic concerns, technology, food insecurities. research and physical and mental health, and then visas, thinking about our international students, thinking about the diversity in that space too. Many folks were, and I'm saying all this because I'm going to tell you what we did about it. Many students, had really, had expressed all these issues about their summer employment and had been canceled at the moment of, where widespread high employment, people's parents were losing their jobs, et cetera. So it left them really uncertain about how to support themselves through the summer. So, and really thinking about the unique needs of international students and diversity in that space, financial needs. I mean, some were unable to return home and feared that they would, not be allowed to return to the U.S. if they did, and others who went home were unsure if they could get back and, in time for fall classes. And then international students who were living in Madison were expressing financial concerns as they were, not funded over the summer, and visa restrictions is a huge thing, and folks weren't able to work on campus, so students were concerned about, compliance with their visas. And then you had obviously these xenophobias and things that would happen with our Asian and Asian American students that were challenging during these times. And so, we really, as an entire school effort, I think everyone pitched in to really make this transition as smooth as possible. And I feel strongly about that, right? And I mean, and we were considering the needs of the most vulnerable. So just last week, for example, applications went out for School of Education Summer Scholarship Program, designed as a bridge to Summer Success Scholarship to provide scholarships to undergraduate students and graduate students who are experiencing financial hardships due to COVID-19, right? So I know our dean and our advancement teams, folks were working really, really hard with generous donors and alumni, and friends of the Schools of Education who were able to, and even in the graduate school too, let me not leave them out, who were able to help us get these scholarships and design to provide eligible, to provide students in the School of Education some work. So, one of the questions that always comes up is like, what could you have done and what should you have done better? And I think that, as it relates to what could have been done better, I think we're still waiting to see the effectiveness on what we've done, right? I thought that it was sort of unprecedented to call all of the students to see what their needs are. We captured that information, we analyzed that data, and we made some decisions based on that data and scholarships and technology needs and all these sorts of things. So I'm all about data-informed decision-making. So once we have a clear understanding of the impact on student and intervention outcomes, I think that we'll have a clear understanding of what we could have done better. But I do think that we were, proactive in trying to figure out how we can meet the needs of our students. Did I answer your question, Cliff? Did I answer your question? What am I missing?
Oh.
I can't hear you.
What?
Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Somehow somebody's turning on mute. Hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Hear me now. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I answered your question, I'm ready for the next question.
No, I just have one concluding question.
Yes.
And I think it requires a tough love response.
Okay.
A phrase I hear at many minority serving institutions. What can UW, the School of Ed, UW-Madison do to address, to first of all, recognize and then address racism?
Okay.
Online question. Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, so I don't think I have enough time to answer everything that we could do. Right. I'll name a few things. Right. I mean, there are some moves. I recognize that the administrators have done some things to try to do things like the Target of Opportunity program. Right. I think that that has increased diversity of our faculty, but we gotta invest in and expand programs like Target of Opportunity program, not just for faculty, right, but for staff, right? And as we think about our issues and some of our climate data, and even some of the work that I've done when I've been here, we've uncovered that a lot of the challenges are with the staff. And so when you think about the demographic makeup of Madison is primarily white. So as I think about the top program, what do we have like that for staff, one, and then thinking about the spousal hire. I'm gonna get real with y'all real quick. If you are a person of color and you're coming to work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and you're single, the likelihood of you finding a partner of color is highly unlikely, right? It's a challenge. I've had many friends of color who have left because of that reason, for that, just that reason. We haven't even gotten to anything else, right? Or they find partners elsewhere. So we need to think about spousal hires, right? And we need to think more closely about not necessarily just in the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but what partners do we have in the community where we can bring people here who are partnered, where their partners can have jobs as well, right? Thinking about racism specifically, we have to invest in affinity-based spaces. And all too often, because of where we are located, right down from the legislator, and because of the tilt of our legislator, we try to be politically correct and very cautious of doing any specific outreach to specific groups. I think of institutions like that I'm familiar with and that, that Cliff is familiar with, University of Michigan, and they have things like Black graduation, right? And I've had this conversation with a ton of people and like, oh, no, we couldn't do that. Why not? Because what Black graduation does for people at the University of Michigan is provide an opportunity for them to come back every year to support the institution. And so, when you think about these, often the argument is that the more, affinity groups or affinity spaces that you make, that you give, it creates, separation. Guess what? As a Black man, I don't have to be reminded to engage with white folks because every space I go is white. So to have this affinity space, you know what I mean, where we could build some solidarity, shared experiences to build each other up in times where we're down, it's going to be important. So racial affinities, thinking about racial affinity campus committees. This came up in a conversation with the chancellor and the provost the other day. Committees and spaces. Where do specific non-white groups have a voice on campus? Where in governance on campus do they have a voice? Right? We got to think about how our policies and practices were created and what informed those policies. So one of the things that that we're working on in the school, and we're going to be announcing this week, initial meetings, racial affinity groups, especially for our white colleagues. One of the most frustrating things for me as a person who does diversity is that the focus is always on people of color. Now, yes, we have to create spaces, we have to create a sense of belonging, but how do you do that without training and or professional development of majority populations? Because I can even if something happens and something's communicated to me, we support you, LaVar, blah 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 blah. Okay, but I still got to go out here with all these white people. I'm just gonna keep it real with y'all. If y'all okay with me, I got to live with these white. I got to live with all of these microaggressions and macroaggressions and bias and all these things So it's funny. Like as Ruth King says, it's not enough to think we can simply get a racially diverse group in one room and hash it out. Like many of us have been there and have done that like to no avail. We show up with good intentions, but we're afraid, we're unclear, we're unskilled, angry, cautious, defensive, all of which gets in the way of us connecting and being real, right? So regularly we put our foot in our mouths and then become frustrated, belligerent, or defensive, or just shut down, right? Because of, our feelings, white guilt, whatever the case may be, right? So in racial affinity groups, like we put ourselves in intentional spaces with people of our same race where we could be safe enough to be vulnerable, to be challenged, to be unedited, right? To examine the stories we've been told and the stories we tell ourselves, to lean toward what is, unfamiliar and away from what is our habits, to understand what is difficult to acknowledge, to feel, and to tend to within us, and among us as a racial group. So when I say us as a racial group, I'm talking about white people with white people, black people with black people, Latinx folks, indigenous folks, et cetera. So this is happening in pockets on campus, but could and should be seated, in my opinion, in every school, college, and unit. It's difficult to even think about combating racist policies, practices, or curriculum if we can't first do the introspective work necessary to recognize our bias and shortcomings that perpetuate racism in our university, right? So we've been having this conversation a lot, too, about mandatory training. So our climate data, the Inclusive Excellence Report, and my conversations with over 100, faculty, staff, and students in the School of Education all echo the sentiments of the need for faculty, graduate students, and staff to participate in mandatory professional development and merit assessment procedures that support anti-racist classrooms and curriculum. Right? Everybody's saying we should do it. I think there's this hesitancy from leadership that we can't make people do this or we can't make people do that when everybody is claiming that they want it. Department chairs, staff, I mean, not everybody, but and again, I will admit, I was talking to our dean the other day about the fact that there are some issues in the School of Education. Yes. There's some things we need to work on. Yes. It can be and has appeared to be worse in a lot of other spaces on campus. So as I think about the willingness of folks here that I've talked to, many faculty, like, dozens of faculty, staff, and students who want this, I think that it's an opportunity for the School of Education to provide leadership to the campus in these regards, right? And then the other piece of it is, and I'll stop with this so we can get questions or what have you, we got to promote and design structures for civil discourse on campus. Like we got to be able to talk to each other, right? And we know that there are things like the discussion project, things like that. We got to go deeper, right? We got to be more broad spread. The topic of free speech is really a lightning rod for college campuses, particularly in the wake of high national racial tension and polarizing government partisanship. We know that college campuses are central to students finding their voices, and these years for students really embody the most politically active that they will ever be. But the challenge has become like enabling our students to exercise their free speech while also teaching them the value of and respect for others' point of view, right? This is not just a challenge for students, but also our faculty and staff who are trying to usher in the sifting, as Cliff would say, sifting and winnowing of ideas in their classrooms and other campus spaces. And so we need more activities that promote a welcoming, comfortable environment where we could have processes that are designed to inform innovative models for participating in facilitating sensitive topics, conversations, programs, initiatives. The last thing I'll say. We are way too reactionary, right? Like it's always a town hall, which is the worst. Like even if we have a town hall, I never want to call it that again because those are always reactionary. Wouldn't it be awesome to have a structure in place already, right? Proactive, a structure in place where we already wrestle with these ideas. So when and if a crisis happen, we're able to just use those avenues to engage in some problem solving, right? As opposed to like trying to create something in response to something that happens like the murder of George Floyd. We got to create social outlets for folks of color, both in the institution and out and in the community, right? Like I shouldn't have to go to Milwaukee or Chicago to listen to some soul music. We got to create more cultural outlets in our community so that Madison truly embraces all communities and culture, not just German culture, right? So shrinking the education opportunities and gaps, which is what the school is trying to do. We got to do more work on that. We got to hold people accountable for bad behavior, like behavior that we say is anti who we are, and we can't keep acting like hate speech is not free. Hate speech is free speech. From our leaders on down, we have to condemn these sorts of actions swiftly, loudly. People who behave in this way this is my philosophy, people who behave in this way need to feel like they don't belong rather than ostracize and minoritized groups, ostracize and, minoritized groups that make them feel like they don't belong. We need to lead from our values and leverage moments of crisis to drive institutional transformation. So I could say so much more, but I'll stop there. Yeah.
We very much appreciate your speaking so freely, your straight talk, and concluding with your call for courageous conversations before incidents happen in the school, on the campus, and far beyond. We would like to turn now to the Q&A questions. There's Carrie. Cliff is having a little trouble accessing the Q&A question. So I think Carrie will ask the very first question. Carrie, could you do that?
Yeah, sure. Here's one. LaVar, you are a prolific scholar, publishing more than 20 articles in the previous few years. Is there an article or two that you are drawing on for evidence-based practices that we should be thinking about, re graduate education in the School of Ed?
Regarding graduate education. Oh, wow. Who
Uh,
sent that? I could send you some stuff. But I need to look. Is it something that I'm drawing on? If I can be quite frank, um, and this sounds very vain, but most of the work that I've done in my career, um, has been in this area. Like, the last few things that I've published have been in this area. So, is there one? I've been building on my own work for a while. That sounds bad. That sounds bad. But whoever that person is, let me get back because there's not. I can't tell you like, this is what I'm looking at to do X, Y, and Z. When you sort of do this work, and remember, I worked at Wisconsin Equity and Inclusion Laboratory for a long time, and so we were constantly we were sort of creating knowledge in this space as it relates to graduate education, particularly graduate folks going into STEM fields, and we were producing this work based on original research. And so, for example, broadening participation in computing sciences, my colleagues and I have probably, within the last 10, 15 years have written like 75% as it relates to African Americans going into this space. So a lot of the stuff was based on our projects. So I don't have one. Now, I could reference some stuff, some things that, but I honestly, I know that sounds bad, but I don't have a specific like, hey, I'm referencing this as I'm doing my work. Like, I've done this work enough where I typically reference my own stuff. You know what I'm saying? That sounds very audacious, but I could definitely share some other stuff if you send me an email, and I can send you some stuff. I just need to sort of review my references and things of that nature. So I apologize that I'm not able to answer that very well.
Go ahead, Carrie.
You're muted, Carrie. I can't hear you.
Sorry about that.
All right.
How do we shift the paradigm so that university administrators, for example, finance, payroll, etc., who might be removed from the academic process, see themselves as critical players in creating inclusive excellence and an equitable campus culture?
I mean, that's a really great question. We have to, in shifting the paradigm, we have to ensure, and I think that this awakening for some is not new for many of us. It's sort of doing that right in this present time with all the protests that's going on. With we have a new provost who is really interested in creating senses of belonging in schools and colleges. He's working. They have some teams I know about. That they're getting the deans together. We have more increasingly associate and assistant deans for diversity, and the plan is to see those in all schools and colleges. So, and we have those in just about all of them, and we meet regularly. So we are working very, very closely with our deans. The deans are working with the provost and working with the chief diversity officer in that space, and all these folks from HR to Lauren Heller. Last name, is that the right name? Our people who are in our leadership are starting to look at this very closely. We can't ignore it anymore, right? And here's the thing where we hold people to the fire. We got people were opposing all these. I was on some conversations where people were like, all these statements, this stuff, we need more, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, you got to remember, before we didn't even have these statements, right? We didn't have statements that explicitly named racism as issues. We didn't have that. That's new. That's new to me. So at that point, now we hold people's feet to the iron, right? They have the Student Inclusion Coalition. They've been working with administrators. They have a set of demands that we're working on. We had the protests before even the COVID-19 stuff. And with these things that are happening, we're forced to sort of look at policies and practices. And I think it's all of our responsibilities. Our dean's responsibility is my responsibility to push these things forward. I know oftentimes one of my challenges or pushbacks on administration is that, which is a good thing. Like we have to, and Cliff and I were talking about this earlier, it has to be sort of a ground up, and it has to be a sandwich approach, right, coming from the bottom and from the top. But I think that too often, that our schools and colleges are autonomous, and then that central administration. This is my opinion, so if somebody might be on here and get mad at me for saying this, but we all too often leave things that should be, centrally governed to schools and colleges. If this is an aim and goal of our institution, right, then what sort of policies and practices do we have at these different levels for HR, administration, all these things that really push us and move us to the direction of being progressive in these spaces of being anti-racist. Right now, I think it's a prime time, and it's going to be difficult to ignore these things moving forward, and we're all moving towards that direction.
Thank you. So, what about, here's a question regarding other schools and colleges at UW-Madison or other student services units. How can they help support the work of the School of Education or your goals?
Yeah, one of the things that I like about this, and this has sort of been, I think it was intended to be the goal. One of the things that we're doing in our MDCs, which I hate this name, so I'm gonna say it, but I hate the titles, and it was like legislative from UW system or the state legislator or something back in the day. But minority MDCs, minority disadvantaged coordinators, right? That's what those names are. That's what MDCs. And every school and college is required to have one. What we've been doing in this last year, our EDCs, which are our campus level equity and diversity committee, and our campus level, our MDCs across schools and colleges have really been working together, have really been sharing best practices, have really been, as we are, pushing our schools and colleges, particularly for those of us who work for the dean, we've been centralizing our efforts and really leveraging one another. Like, I think this is, again, I might get in trouble for this, but I think there's this unsaid competition between schools and colleges, right? So who's doing what, how well are they doing it, and how can we gain from that? So that's already happening. And I think that as we continue to sort of move in this direction, that's why I always say the School of Education could and should be leaders in this space, because campus is watching. And I could just say from a personal level, when things go down, like, we're all talking to each other across the schools and colleges about our reactions to things, our interventions to things, and what we're doing. So that's why, you had all these letters of support and solidarity, but we're all talking though anyway. So even those whose deans are not as not as progressive as maybe our dean is, we leverage each other to move other deans. So I hope I don't have too many people in this conversation that these statements are going to get me in trouble, but it is what it is.
All right, here's a question about teacher education. What recommendations do you have for how we do teacher education in the School of Ed or teacher professional learning?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're working on that we need to do is we need to, we're working on the recruiting more faculty and staff of color for our teacher education programs, and we have some in there. We're working on increasing culturally responsive practices. We're collaborating. I mean, and I'm saying, when I say we're doing it, I mean, like, we need to continue and we need to dive into this, not like as an excuse, like, oh, we're already doing this. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we have work to do in these areas, and we're working on that. It's interesting. I got a letter this past week, and our web presence and all those sorts of things, and we didn't talk about that today, but that makes a difference, right? And so how we even center diversity and inclusion on our web page has been instrumental, because I get students who are interested in teacher education emailing me, like, I'm interested in social justice, prospective students. So these are like high school kids, who are interested in all these sorts of things. And so we have to center our focus on anti-racism, anti-racist education. And we just, I'm happy we got Dr. A.J. Welton, who's in Education Leadership Policy Analysis, who's doing this work. We got, new faculty who are doing this anti-racist work. We have to center that in our curriculum. We have to provide professional development for our teacher educators. We have to, as we think of our, what's the word I'm looking for, our in-service teachers and all those, and the training that they get, it's all relative, right? So we have to have these sorts of folks in the community so we can send our teachers to get trained by them, which is a problem. We don't have enough, right? So, but we as a School of Education have to build community partnerships to build that pipeline, to get our teachers in MMSD schools and surrounding schools, so that we have, educators who can really help train our future educators in this work as well. So we just have to keep working on it and collaborating around culturally responsive practices, both in our classrooms in the college as well as K-12 education as well. And there's some community partners who are doing this stuff really, really well, who's working on this stuff. And that's part of what team, I think I mentioned team earlier, from Forward Madison, that's what they're doing, building that partnership. We need to increase support for programs like that. Again, you know, you put your money where your mouth is. So as we talk about being an anti-racist institution, and we get these letters from, you know, myself and the dean and the president and the chancellor and the provost and all that. Okay, where are the resources, right? Where are we recruiting from? We have to increase our recruitment, you know, and all those sorts of things. So it's a multi-pronged approach to really answering that question. It's not an easy answer, but we have to do all these things collectively.
So we're close to 1 o'clock. I'm afraid. Thank you all for your questions. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but you know, please do feel free to email LaVar. Is that okay, LaVar?
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe we can conclude with one final one. What can students or professionals do to support or amplify the voices of their Black peers?
Yeah, we have to understand the damage that we do. I know that sounds hard. It sounds harsh, right? As I talk to, you know, faculty and staff. I mean, let me keep it real during the time of George Floyd. Folks are tired, right? Folks are not ready to have cross-cultural dialogue right now, right? So the best thing that we can do is educate ourselves. Like, it's these racial affinity groups. I think we need to do that, right? We need to get into that. We need to understand how we are either helping or contributing to the damage that is done by systemic racism that permeates our policies, practices, and curriculum. Like, we, you know, if we're not being diverse in the text that we're providing, if we're not thinking about ways in which we are promoting culturally responsive learning, right? Culturally responsive teaching, right? So how are we embracing folks in our classroom? How are we embracing difference in our classroom? How are we using cultural knowledge, prior experience, and frames of reference, as well as understanding diverse students' learning styles to make learning more effective and relevant, right? We understand, because a cultural separation between a faculty or staff member and a student, you know, facilitates poor academic outcomes, right? Understanding, you know, even whether that's in person or in virtual learning environments, understanding, you know, all of the weight of society that comes with us as we move into these spaces that are often damaging for us too, right? Or dismissive of our experiences too. So I know we're above our time and we could talk more about that, but we have to do a lot of self-work, which is why I'm pushing these racial affinity groups, or RAG.
I'd like to express our collective enthusiasm for your candor, your breathtaking candor, which I think was very, very helpful. Your wellspring of ideas for problem solving, including racism and including systemic racism. And finally, and not least, in some ways, I want to say, I think many will, I certainly do, find it very inspiring to have you here today. It gives me hope that there are pathways, the kind of pathways that you've suggested. Okay? And so we, all of us, I'm sure, are very appreciative of your sharing with such, once again, candor, your thoughts.
Thank you all for having me. And I'll leave with this quote that I always use. It's from Margaret Mead, one of the mothers of feminism. She says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So thank you all.
Thank you.